Poppy Playtime is a game known both for its super in-depth, but also very complex and confusing story, hidden throughout dozens of documents, VHS tapes, multiple chapters, ARGs, a spin-off, a book, a Fortnite map, and more. So much so, it would take me hours to explain the entire story. And that's why, for the next 2.5 hours, I'm gonna fully break down and explain all of the lore in my updated Poppy Playtime timeline.
My name is Elliot Ludwig.
The Bigger Bodies Initiative.
We called it the Hour of Joy. Fun.
Can make better.
Reminder, as always, this timeline is just my opinion of the story based on what we have now, but relax and I hope you guys enjoy. The entire story of the game starts in the year 1930, with a man named Elliot Ludwig living in Michigan. Elliot was a normal man with a normal life and a normal wife named Molly Ludwig, who you wouldn't think twice about when seeing around town. However, deep down, Elliot was extremely ambitious. He enjoyed creating and inventing things, but most of all, he loved to see people happy. So one day he had a great idea to create some happiness of his own by starting a toy factory to provide entertainment and smiles to children and families around the world, leading to the founding of Playtime Co. this same year. From here, Elliot grinded for long hours at the factory trying to get the company off the ground, and eventually it got to a point where he started to prioritize the families he was making toys for over his own family back home, leaving his house for work in the early morning and not returning until the late night, to the point where his own neighbors found him to be weird and creepy. After so many months of Elliot doing this, his wife had felt completely abandoned by his commitment, and so not even a year after the factory's opening, Molly Ludwig would divorce Elliot, leaving him all alone. The Playtime factory was still only minorly successful at this point, enough to keep the doors open, but no iconic toys to blast the company into the mainstream or anything like that. However, despite this, Elliot wanted to take his love for providing happiness to children to the next level, as he quickly realized that among the many families he had already been starting to bring so much joy to with his toys, there were also many children that had no family, orphans. And while for the moment, at the small size of the company, there wasn't much Playtime Co. or Elliot could really do about this, in the year 1949, on March 7th, a child was born under the name Poppy. Poppy's past, for the most part, is left a mystery, but we know that she must have been an orphan herself, as shortly after her birth, Elliot would make his first attempt at solving the orphan problem by taking her in and adopting the young child, giving her the new name Poppy Ludwig. And little did they know that this moment would change the trajectory of their lives and the Playtime factory forever. Elliot was now a single father to the young child Poppy, and he absolutely adored her, caring for her deeply despite his long hours at the factory, cherishing that he once again had a family. And eventually, to show his appreciation for her, he chose to make an ode to her in the factory by creating a toy completely dedicated to Poppy of a doll that he named Poppy Playtime. The Poppy Playtime doll was an absolute mastermind creation of Elliot's. Using his inventor skills, he managed to create a doll that was more technologically advanced than any other at the time, being able to talk to the children and hold a conversation like she was a real person. Furthermore, her red hair was super realistic and smelled of poppy flowers, which would soothe the children that interacted with it, giving it a therapeutic element as well. This toy, upon release, would absolutely absolutely explode Elliot's company into stardom. Millions of families would purchase the toy for their homes, providing the joy to the many children that Elliot was striving to reach for so many years now. This was everything he ever wanted. With such a big growth of the company, Elliot would also start to hire out some help to make operations more efficient, bringing on employees such as Thomas Clark in 1955, or most importantly, around a similar time, he hired Leith Pierre, an employee he was much closer to than the others, putting him in charge of innovation at the factory, and he had even let him meet his daughter, Poppy. Although, make no mistake, Leith was a lot different personality-wise from Elliot, being much more arrogant and business-minded, although under Elliot's leadership, he was still a great fit and only helped the factory more. Furthermore, Elliot would also revamp the factory with things like the grab pack to make building these toys not just easier, but also fun, his main goal with everything. Then he struck gold again, as he made another toy in the late 1950s called Doughy Dough, a Play-Doh-esque moldable clay featuring the mascot Doughy the Dough Man, which shot the factory's popularity up even further. Things were going amazingly for Elliot. He had a daughter that he could call a part of his family after being left alone for years, and his factory was reaching explosive heights all thanks to her. Safe to say, it was a good time to be Elliot Ludwig in the 1950s. Following the boom of the Playtime Company, Elliot was able to provide more forms of joy for families when he would open up his factory for official tours, where anybody could come inside and view how the many toys he was creating were built. He even would invent the Make a Friend machine in 1960 so that the visitors of the factory could come inside and create their very own toys out of this cartoonish toy maker, with levers to pull and eyes that moved around like it was really living. On the topic of Poppy the human, she had just reached 11 years old in March of that same year, and as she grew up, she only became more and more in love with Elliot's factory. She wrote in her diary how much she adored all of the new toys Elliot was creating every single year, with the most recent one being some kind of sailor toy, as she wrote. Now, at this point, she had begun going to school for a while, and with her status as the daughter of the famous Elliot Ludwig, other kids would often talk with her about him and warned her that as she got older, she would grow bitter and her love for the factory would wane over time. But she didn't care what they said, she loved it. Elliot would also tell her that he eventually wanted to build more Playtime Co facilities all across the world one day, and she hoped to travel there to see them when they were finished. Beyond Poppy, though, the factory would create more successful toys like Brawn the Dinosaur in 1961 and Boxy Boo in 1966, among presumably many other undated experiments like Pianosaurus and his dinosaur band to keep growing the factory further. However, as the years went on, Elliot wanted to do even more to help out children, as while sure, the factory was doing its job great, and he had also adopted an orphan to give her a better life, he knew he could do so much more good if he just kept innovating. So, while nothing much would come from it for now, he began to mess with the idea of scientific experimentation. Specifically, he wanted to see if it were possible to not just improve the lives of the living children with material objects, but also potentially extend the lives of the children biologically. It sounded like a crazy overambitious goal, but when did that ever stop him when creating the factory? Over this time, he would begin to run these little mini experiments with things like rats, attempting to find a way to scientifically resurrect them. Now, for the first few hundred experiments, things were unsuccessful, but by experiment 814, he had created some kind of red gel mixture made with poppy flowers that he would submerge deceased rats into, hoping for them to resurrect. This did not work, but it gave Elliot hope that there was a future there with the poppy gel, especially since he theorized that there would potentially be better results working on larger test subjects. process. And so from here on out, he would continue testing out the technology with a far cry goal that maybe at some point it could be used to revive actual people. But anyway, at some point in the 60s, Elliot also had another idea to help children in need, specifically when it came to building careers, as he would develop and launch the Young Geniuses program, a program where children could visit the factory and help Elliot Ludwig with innovation, meant to be a way to both get children involved with the invention part of the factory and to scout out intelligent minds that could help develop the factory when they got older, especially when it came to the experimental stuff that he was starting to tinker with. Many children would apply to this program and many would get accepted, like Charlie Moff, Bruno White, Benjamin Rutherford, and most importantly of all, there was a child named Harley Sawyer. Harley was a very quiet and isolated child with a very shaky life back home, and that showed when he visited the factory, as he had little care for talking or friendship. However, he took a very intense liking to Elliot and the scientific process. He enjoyed getting to learn from him and said being a part of the program was all that he had ever wanted. Not only that, but he was extremely intelligent. He was even described as the most brilliant mind that Elliot had ever seen. Despite this, Ludwig was quick to keep an eye on Sawyer, as it was clear that with a mind as cynically dedicated to progress as Harley's, if not surrounded by kindness, it could quickly twist for the worst. And as time passed, that's exactly what happened, because Elliot and Harley began to quickly not get along for one very simple reason. While Elliot believed in research and innovation for the sake of helping others, Harley, as mentioned, was much more cynical and believed that progress was the most important thing at any cost. This led to Harley believing that Elliot was soft and was missing the point of innovation, but that mindset is what led to Elliot eventually removing Harley from the program despite his geniusness. And while this would send Harley down a complete mental spiral, saying that nobody cared or nobody understood, or he even called Elliot a soft, pathetic, small-minded backstabber, for now he was out of the factory, probably for the better. This made Elliot sad, but unfortunately, things would get a whole lot worse for him, as suddenly and tragically, his daughter, Poppy Ludwig, would end up passing away far, far too young. And just like that, again, Elliot's only family member had left him, this time his own daughter. This brought him to his lowest point mentally, but that doesn't mean that things were completely hopeless. We already mentioned before that Elliot had began messing around with the idea of biological experimentation and specifically resurrection, stuff that didn't work on rats, but as he noted in the experiment log, had potential to work on larger test subjects, perhaps a human. This gave him the desperate and quite frankly insane idea to try experimenting on his own daughter and attempt to revive her, specifically settling on the idea of turning her into a Poppy Playtime doll, since after all, the doll was meant to be a toy recreation of herself anyway, and the porcelain synthetic build of the doll would allow her to bypass the mortality of a normal human body. Elliot thought it would be worth the attempt. But with how little experience he had, he knew it would be extremely risky to essentially take apart his own daughter surgically, especially with how difficult it would be to transfer her entire human body to the small shell of a doll. He'd only have one shot at creating her, but he just wasn't confident enough in himself, and he needed some way to practice, giving him an extremely desperate but also extremely sketchy idea. Out of desperation, Elliot would adopt himself a new child, a son under the name of Oliver. However, he did not adopt this orphan with plans to nurture and take care of them like he did with Poppy, but rather he took advantage of the fact that he was a child with no parents to look after him if he were to, say, disappear. And therefore, going against all of his morals he had established over the past few decades, he experimented on the child first and turned him into a large-scale model of the planned Poppy doll's hand skeleton, since that was the smallest part of the doll and therefore the hardest to create. He worked hard on the experiment, using this mysterious red gel to hopefully bring the child back to life in this new form, and to his absolute shock, it was a complete success. He had proved that he could create a living, breathing toy with his 1006th experiment. However, among all of this panic trying to find a way to revive his daughter, Elliot failed to consider the fact that what he had just done was essentially turn an entirely innocent, healthy child into a morbid, robotic beast. When Oliver woke up and saw the being that he had been turned into, he was rightfully mortified and was more specifically angry. He was taken advantage of for the sake of a different child that he never even knew, and this devastated him. He didn't feel like a human being anymore, and even refused to go by his old name Oliver, and instead just wanted to be called the Prototype, since that's all he considered himself anymore. A prototype sacrificed for somebody else's creation. If there was any good news among all of this tragedy, though, it was that using the large hand model as a reference, Elliot would eventually work on his actual daughter and would successfully surgically replace and revive her as a Poppy Playtime doll. Experiment 1007. Poppy Ludwig was back. Now, this was phenomenal news, but Elliot no longer could stand the idea of wasting so much of his time away at work when he should be cherishing the time with his clearly fragile family he almost lost for the second time. So this time around, he decided to bring his family to work, building a small home inside of the factory right across from his office where he put Poppy, allowing him to easily visit her just a few steps away and have some kind of family life like he always had wanted. Although I should note, somebody not included in this family equation was Oliver. Despite Elliot telling Oliver that they could still be a family,
we could be a family if you want,
and that him and Poppy would get along great, he wouldn't let him meet Poppy, despite him constantly asking. The reason for this is unknown, but it's most likely that Elliot was scared of the prototype. Because as we mentioned, 1006 was specifically extremely angry, and Elliot probably didn't want to risk allowing something into the home with Poppy that could possibly harm her once again. Nonetheless, Elliot got what he wanted with the return of Poppy, and that's where this decade came to a bittersweet close. With the continued success of the factory, new toys would be created like Candy Cat, a rolling gumball machine, and Yarnaby, a fluffy rainbow lion with hair made of yarn, meant to promote a wildlife conservation campaign, another good deed of Elliot's. Eventually, in 1972, Elliot would partner with a construction company, Warrenbach Construction, to expand the Playtime Co building further, creating all sorts of new areas, namely a full-blown innovation wing, all sorts of production lines, and a Playtime Co theater where they could play shows for tour guests, to name a few. However, the biggest thing that they would create during this time would be in 1976, when Elliot revisited his relationship with orphans. While it had been rocky up until this point, to say the least, he still valued them, and possibly out of guilt for what he had done with Ali, he decided to create an entire orphanage program under his company, centered around providing homes and happiness to those without parents, starting the Playtime Co. Foster and Adoptive Care Initiative to encourage the adoption of children among Playtime Co. employees, while also having Warrenbach build an entirely new place to house them in Playcare, an orphanage below the ground that was domed off and designed to recreate essentially a paradise for children. It gave them beds to sleep, schools to learn, counselors to talk to, a toy store, a playground, all throughout a massive city facade. Elliot would also hire all sorts of upper-level employees at or around this time, like Stella Graber, who would manage Playcare, Jimmy Roth, the head of marketing, Stewart, who would be the current head of shipping, and Eddie Ritterman, the head of research, among others. At this point in Playtime Co.'s history, they were certainly successful, and the factory would continue to expand as normal with the creation of toys like the Swapimals, a line of expandable toys featuring PJ Pugapillar and Catbee. There was Bunzo Bunny, and they even made an action figure based off of the popular Doughy Dough toy, Doughy the Doughman. But now, being 30 years removed from the release of Poppy Playtime, the factory's best days appeared to be behind them. That is, until the year 1984, when Elliot and Playtime would release none other than Huggy Wuggy, a blue, hairy, smiling stuffed animal that absolutely exploded the factory's popularity to even higher levels than the Poppy doll ever did. Huggy quickly became Playtime Co.'s most successful toy, selling millions, and it wouldn't take long for them to capitalize on this success further by immediately turning around and releasing a pink female version of Huggy named Kissy Missy just a year later in 1985, expanding the universe even wider, along with releasing the mini Huggies around this point for a more affordable version as well. Playtime Co. now had hit a completely new peak. It was making more money than ever, selling more toys than ever, and most importantly to Elliot, helping and providing joy to more people than ever. Although, speaking on Elliot, at this point he was beginning to get quite old, working on the factory for over 50 years now. And so he began to scale back into retirement, allocating more and more duties to his right-hand man, Leith Pierre, to be his presumed successor once he fully was retired. Although he wouldn't really get to retire, because brewing beneath all of this newfound success over all of these years was Oliver, or the prototype's, rage against Elliot for what he had done to him. After years, now his anger had finally reached a boiling point, and it was his time to get revenge. Eventually, the prototype would attack and kill Elliot, before then attempting to make an escape through Playcare, where he'd temporarily hide among all of the other children. After Elliot's mysterious disappearance, at first nobody knew what happened to his body, but it wouldn't take too long for them to find out. As moving back over into Playcare, the prototype wanted to brake for the next exit. However, in order to power on the back door he wanted to use to escape, he would need to power it with 2 green grab pack hand charges. An attachment for the grab pack developed so that employees could power on doors whenever they wanted. Obviously, he couldn't power these on because he was just a hand, and also risked being caught when trying to steal the equipment. However, for as limited as he was physically, he had grown to mentally be extremely intelligent, and more specifically manipulative, because he eventually befriended a child inside of Playcare named Theodore Grambow, a young 7-year-old kid that sadly didn't have very many friends. However, the prototype offered to befriend him and would live under his bed, pretending to be a, quote, imaginary friend, as to not raise any suspicion if the kid were to talk about him. Anyway, 1006 manipulated Theo into digging through Playtime Co documents and eventually collected the 2 grab packs and 2 green hand attachments they needed, before finally planning an escape one night through the aforementioned exit. However, while trying to do this, Theo, still being a young child, ended up shocking himself with the green hand and was critically injured. Now, the prototype could have and maybe should have ran away and left Theo here to die. However, I guess realizing that he'd be no better than the man he just killed if he himself were to destroy the life of another orphan by leaving him here, the prototype instead alerted the staff to the child's injuries, both saving Theo's life, but also leading to the discovery of the prototype, and perhaps most importantly, Elliot's body, finally giving them some kind of reason for his disappearance. He was killed by this thing. Nonetheless, the factory workers were horrified by what they saw, especially the company's new leader, Leith Pierre. And upon trying to talk to the prototype in containment to figure out what happened or develop some kind of motive, he simply wouldn't talk or do anything to give any kind of explanation. However, to learn more about this Playcare incident, Leith would hire himself a private investigator named Jared Lockhart, who he tasked with investigating all of these incidents and going through Elliot's files, specifically to hopefully learn more about what this random metal claw creature is meant to be, only for Jared to find mentions and later discover that there was a second creation, Experiment 1007, Poppy, the real living Poppy. This doll perplexed Leith because while she was much more willing to talk and give him answers, which was helpful, she introduced herself as Poppy Ludwig, as in Elliot's daughter, and she even remembered meeting Leith years ago and had the same voice from back then as well. Although notably, she didn't particularly look happy, but rather appeared to be traumatized by everything, likely because her father was dead. While Leith would be thrown another curveball when, throughout Elliot's files, they found mentions of the resurrecting red poppy gel as well. Now, as confusing as discovering all of this must have been, Leith, being the businessman he was, quickly saw a ton of potential in all of this for the company. Elliot first burst onto the scene with the lifelike Poppy doll, but if they could now figure out how to use all of this tech to make toys as realistic as this Poppy doll, it would put any other toy company out of business. They wouldn't be able to compete. Now, unfortunately, Leith didn't have the technical know-how to take these things apart and definitely wouldn't know how to recreate them, but he knew some people that maybe could. As another thing that Elliot had left behind was the Young Geniuses program, filled with a list of ambitious children from decades in the past. Leith would have his investigator, Jared, track down every single member of the program and figure out what happened to them all. Some people built up normal, successful careers doing things like anesthesiology. Some people appeared to be dead. Others had no descriptions at all. However, there was one person that stood out to the team, Harley Sawyer. Now, Dr. Harley Sawyer, who had many years of what they called, quote, practical experience, being certified by the ABNS, or the American Board of Neurological Surgery, meaning that after his run-in with the factory, Harley had become a professional in neurology, or the study of the brain. This, along with his reported high-level intelligence in the past and obsession with Playtime Co, made him everything the factory needed right now. Although, there were still a lot of worries about his reported temperament as a child, so despite him being by far the best candidate, they would instead avoid him and would rather hire a few other scientists from the program, namely Bruno White, Anthony Carrizales, and Carmine and Evelyn McCabe. Upon bringing them all in to study everything, they too were unsuccessful at understanding the these creations with how complex they were, and the only person to have any real documented success would be Anthony, who couldn't recreate any of Elliot's inventions or anything, but he was able to make something interesting of his own. A red poppy flower based gas that he would call Aeternum Somnium, Latin for eternal sleep, because it was found that when a subject would breathe the gas in, it would immediately put them to sleep, eventually being renamed to the better known red smoke. And while sure it didn't bring them any closer to solving the experiments or even being useful in any way, especially since it had a ton of negative side effects like hallucinations, unusual heart activity, and chills, it was still very interesting, and the company would keep producing and testing this stuff into the future to see if it could be useful. Now, I'll touch more again on all the experimental stuff in a moment, but for now, the factory wasn't focused on that, because eventually they discovered that Elliot's files hid one more important thing: plans for a never-released toy line called the Smiling Critters. A set of 8 themed characters designed to come with plushes that dispensed various scents and had a cartoon centered around them. With the factory raking in dough with the Wuggy's success, Leith had a ton of faith in this conceptual line, and therefore dumped as much of their new fortune as they could into developing and releasing the line ASAP, hoping for it to be a massive success, releasing in 1989. However, it was extremely controversial. For the cartoon, only one season was ever produced because it was hated by almost everybody that watched it, mostly for how creepy one of the critters were, Catnap, who, unlike all of the others with these bold and outgoing happy personalities, was stone cold silent. And in one of the episodes, he dispensed a red smoke to the critters to make them sleep, a direct nod to the smoke being produced in the factory, which creeped children out. And furthermore, when producing the plush line with all of the toys' unique scents, Catnap was supposed to dispense a clear lavender scent, but instead he dispensed none other than the red smoke itself, causing the owners of the plush not to be soothed, but rather to fall into an intense sleep with horrifying nightmares. This disaster led to the Catnap plush being recalled, but Playtime Co. was put under so much backlash that the line itself would never really recover, and despite them publicly pretending that the Smiling Critters were a success, the company was basically financially ruined by this. They would attempt to sort of resurrect the line with a sequel in The Nightmare Critters, but the tragedy of the Smiling Critters would leave that unsuccessful as well. They would also attempt to recreate the Wuggy's craze by making a similarly themed character, Chum Chompkins, that was also not very well received. Not only that, but with the disappearance of Elliot to the outside world, eventually police would search his home, and inside of a duffel bag upstairs, they would find a body of a young boy with missing organs and bones. The body that once made up the child Oliver. This report going public shed another new negative light on the company, and while Playtime Co. proclaimed his innocence, neighbors noted Elliot's creepy behavior when he would suspiciously leave the house at random times at night, building more of an eerie narrative around the factory. The founder was dead, and the happy image they had built for decades was beginning to crumble. Following all of these disasters around the company, it seemed like Playtime Co. was going to fall under Leith Pierre's leadership, and he needed to figure something out quickly, with his only real hope being the couple of experiments and biological research done by Elliot Ludwig. Sure, he saw the potential in them, but even with the help from the other scientists, they couldn't figure out how any of it was made. However, he did still have one final option: hard Harley Sawyer, by far the smartest and most applicable of any of the studied Young Geniuses program children. Sure, he was super problematic in Playtime Co. years previously, but at this point, the company was desperate for any kind of knowledge that they could get, and so Leith would end up inviting him back all these years later on January 15th of 1990, an invite that Harley was sure to not miss, leading to him officially joining the factory's team. Harley was now back. When entering the factory, he was introduced to Poppy, the prototype, and of course the red gel, with the goal of recreating them. Now first, starting with the gel, after researching it a bit, it was understood that this Poppy gel was a restorative mixture that encouraged cellular regeneration and tissue growth. Essentially, it was how Elliot was able to repair and regenerate the bodies he was experimenting on to give them life. Now, when Playtime Co. studied the medium with Harley, they were actually eventually able to recreate it out of their own poppy flowers. However, upon studying their medium, they learned that it had some harmful effects. Specifically, it would harm human beings that were exposed to it without protection, and when given organic material to feed off of, it would uncontrollably grow. So much so that when testing the red gel on plant life, it immediately grew uncontrollably and even developed massive fruits and vegetables that when consumed by lab rats would then grow and consume their internal organs from the inside out, proving that the gel was dangerously good at reproducing itself and needed to be controlled. So along with the poppy gel, they also had to create a separate negation compound that essentially did the exact opposite and stopped biological growth. Next, Harley would study both the prototype and Poppy to figure out how they were created, taking specifically the more cooperative Poppy apart and seeing what was inside, eventually deciding that he was ready to attempt an experiment of his own. Except there was a problem. These beings were not independent and had to be created from something already living. And as we saw from Elliot's research, smaller subjects wouldn't suffice and they need an actual human being. So where would they find human test subjects to experiment on? Well, Leith and the Playtime Co team was super desperate, so they needed to find something now. Both the prototype and Poppy were made from children, so they'd specifically want to find a child test subject that also wouldn't alert anyone so they wouldn't get caught. Then, just like Elliot, they realized they have an entire orphanage program built into the factory with dozens of children that had no parents and no records outside of the company. If they were to, say, go missing, nobody would notice, exactly like what Elliot did all those years ago. So they began to select and take various children out of Playcare as if they had been quote-unquote adopted and gave them to Sawyer to begin experimenting on them, where at first he was shockingly very unsuccessful. Continuing off Elliot's experiment numbers, by experiment 1015, when transferring a child's mind to a toy, the best Harley could get was minor brain activity, and that was all. Nonetheless, he stayed confident that this is normal, writing, "After all, we are dealing with a field so new it has no name, much less a clear path." By experiment 1026, Sawyer was finally able to build some kind of consciousness within the toys, noting that this experiment was alive for a total of 45 minutes, however, only 3 of those could be considered a conscious state. Upon first signs of awakening, 1026 sat upright as if startled by something. They stared blankly at the other end of the observation room. Of course, assisting staff members rushed in, checking the equipment and asking them a variety of questions. 1026 answered none of them, but directed their gaze at whoever was talking, and was even able to track a moving object, a staff member's index finger, when prompted. Subject then slowly laid back down and closed their eyes. After a few minutes, blood pressure began falling extremely rapidly, and 1026 expired. Attempts to resuscitate were unsuccessful. After over 100 more experiments trying this same thing, Harley continued to fail, and eventually he started to hit a wall. No matter what he did, these tiny toy-sized experiments were far too difficult to recreate, as attempting to stuff all these organs and bones and nerves into something as small as a toy was borderline impossible without absolute perfection. Something Elliot clearly had with the Poppy doll, but something Harley was far from uncovering. However, when taking a closer look at the interior of the Poppy doll through an X-ray, they noticed that the hand of the doll was almost one-for-one identical with the claw of the much larger prototype. This is when Harley realized that before trying to make things small and precise, he first needed to try working on something bigger. For instance, a giant toy, one that wouldn't need to be nearly as precise and could contain all of the proper human biology needed for them to live. The toy he decided to try this idea with was none other than Boxy Boo, under the name Experiment 1160. After working and developing the creation for a while, to his shock, it was a huge success. Boxy could move, he could respond, he was fully sentient, he could do almost everything that they had wanted. He wasn't absolutely perfect, as Elliot's experiments were far more stable, and were also totally immortal in the way that while Boxy Boo had to be fed and actively sustained like a human being, Elliot's experiments did not and realistically couldn't die. But regardless, this was plenty good enough. So Harley now knew how to make the experiments. However, only being able to make large toys instead of small ones, he needed a way to sell the idea of big life-sized experiments to the company so that they would keep funding his research into the future. Therefore, he came up with the idea of the Bigger Bodies Initiative, an initiative where Harley would create these massive toys not to be played with or bought by children as products, but rather to work inside of the factory. This would solve a ton of issues for the company. Their revenue was down from the Playtime Co scandals, and therefore things like lawsuits from them cutting corners became a big concern. However, if they replaced all of the employees with bigger bodies, they would save money because they wouldn't have to pay their salaries, and lawsuits from factory accidents were no longer a concern. It was a perfect idea that Leith and his quote-unquote money men loved, with Harley noting, "They will have their investments and see money saved, and I, Harley Sawyer, will be able to continue on with my work." Now, in order to better mass produce and streamline the production of these toys, they both needed a place to work on them, as well as a place to test the children in Playcare to ensure they had the proper physical and mental abilities before being experimented on. So they would end up renewing Elliot's old contract with Warrenbach Construction to build future creations, and would start by having them develop a laboratory deep below the factory surface where it could never be found. They painted this to Warrenbach as if it was just an innovation and research lab with nothing fishy going on, although to ensure that nobody discovered this build, Eddie Ritterman, the head of research, offered the company 6 figures in hush money to ensure their silence. In this lab, they were given the ability not just to create more and more experiments as needed, but they also began to build little childlike rooms to place experiments in for observation, along with developing what they called quote-unquote conditioning rooms, where they would hire the lead counselor of the area, Gracie Green, and have her play as a young child show host, Miss Gracie, where she'd attempt to brainwash the children into believing that they were and always have been toys, hoping to keep them calm when obviously waking up as these horrifying new bodies. In terms of mass producing the poppy gel that was able to revive these things, down in the labs, they built an autonomous farm system that grew and harvested thousands of poppy flowers, allowing them to produce them in super high quantities and keep experimenting at all times. Furthermore, for testing the children, they also had them build the game station, that on the surface appeared to just be a playground for the children to hang out at, with 3 mini games inside: Musical Memory, a game of Simon, Whack-a-Wuggy, a game of Whack-a-Mole, and Statues, a game of Red Light, Green Light. However, in reality, reality, they had set up observation rooms in all of these areas so that they could log and track the performance of the children, testing their memory, reflexes, and physical ability before considering them for experiments. To hopefully improve the scores further, after some more testing of Anthony's red smoke, it was revealed that despite its many negative side effects, it also produced some positive results in test subjects, like improved brain functions during sleep, increased memory retention, and better emotional processing of the day's events. So in Playcare, they'd have Warrenbach install the gas production zone, which would mass produce this smoke and pump it through some pipes in Home Sweet Home during the night to put the children to sleep, as well as make them better test subjects. This also had the bonus effect of preventing any more incidents like the Theodore Granville one of children getting rowdy at night. Playtime Co. would also hire a ton of scientists to work on these experiments, with the most notable ones being Preston Willard and Jessica Newman. Another employee they hired was the head of IT, Rowan Stoll, and finally, they'd hire various warehouse workers like an angry man named Rich Levitz to handle storage. From here, more bigger bodies were created. For instance, there was Pianosaurus Experiment 1163, who sadly was a pretty big failure as he was described as being extremely feral and was so mentally degraded from the experimentation that while he would attack and try to eat anything he saw, in his eyes, he actually hallucinated the world as being bright and colorful and thought he was simply playing around. This basically made him useless. Then, in August of 1990, there was Experiment 1166, a bigger body of Yarnaby, who was created from a child, Quinn Davidson, a child who actually had a pretty bad performance in the game station at first, before he was mentored by none other than Harley Sawyer, who had a sense that he wasn't trying his best. And so, when retesting, Quinn scored extremely poorly on musical memory, the mental test, while excelling in more physical tests like Whack-A-Wuggy and statues, leading to them experimenting on him and creating Yarnaby, who was more successful than Pianosaurus, although not by that much, as while he was physically excellent, just like his game station assessment suggested, he was also mentally underwhelming, not being able to do much independently, building extreme reliance on security staff to take care of him. If there was any good news from this experiment though, at least for Harley Sawyer, it was that he took advantage of Yarnaby's easy attachment to others, and would therefore isolate the being inside of a room that only Harley would ever visit, allowing him to essentially condition Yarnaby independently to the point where he began to view Harley as almost godlike, something that he found pretty amusing. The first known actual improvement in the Bigger Bodies initiative since Boxy Boo was actually a bigger body of Huggy Wuggy, Experiment 1170, who upon creation was seen as far more successful than any other experiment they had made, specifically because of his obedience paired with intelligence. This led to Playtime Co. designating him as the first known monster to take a real employee's role, being the Playtime Co. security guard, watching over the entrance to the factory so that no intruders would come sneaking in, while also standing still as a statue so that he could be a tourist attraction for people that were visiting, leading to him being one of Playtime Co.'s biggest successes experiment-wise. At least that is at first, as with time, a trend they noticed with him is that when put under stress, he would throw these very large fits, especially during his conditioning when they tried to get him to complete various tasks, which stressed him out to the point that he attacked and tried killing the employees. So, to solve this, they would create a body of his female counterpart, Kissy Missy, Experiment 1172 in late 1990, whose personality was very similar to Huggy, being quiet and obedient. it. She also liked to draw and write, despite her hands making it hard to do so, which is pretty cute. But essentially, they created her to be a friend for Huggy, given to him when he was feeling stressed out, which smoothed out most of his temperament issues nicely. Moving over into the game station, in order to automate the testing process, they would create 3 bigger bodies that would be the mascots of the 3 games. There was a Bunzo Bunny, who was assigned to musical memory, the mini Huggies, who were assigned to Whack-a-Wuggy, of course. Then finally, there was PJ Pugapillar, Experiment 1174, who would run statues. All would play as the game's antagonists to add a bit more of a threat. Then, going over into Playcare, the employees there were also being slowly replaced with experiments. As first off, Playtime would release a doll of a teacher named Miss Delight, and would create 8 identical bigger bodies of her to work as the school's teachers. While for the rest of Playcare, they had an even better plan. They decided to make use of the great idea that was the Smiling Critters by repurposing them as the mascots of Playcare, since down here none of the children were aware of any controversies that surrounded the line. And alongside that branding, they attempted to create bigger bodies of every single one of them to roam around the area. This wouldn't be particularly successful at first, since we saw with Experiment 1186, Bobby Bearhug, that she couldn't speak like they had wanted her to, and suffered from mobility issues. However, by Experiment 1188, they decided they wanted to make a bigger body of none other than Catnap, specifically with plans to attach a red gas apparatus to the monster itself, allowing it to emit the red sleeping smoke as it breathed, planning to let the monster out into Playcare around nighttime so that way the children could be put to sleep by a character they knew and trusted. But before creating an experiment like this, they needed the perfect test subject. They looked around and listed a few different children as possible patients. However, one stood out above all of the others: Theodore Grambell. Theo, since being saved by the prototype, was on Playtime Co's radar, not just because he had a lack of friends, making it much easier to remove him without anyone noticing, but also knowing he was easy to be manipulated and was a little bit of a troublemaker. They decided to eliminate all of that risk by turning him into the bigger body Catnap, which, upon doing so, compared to Bobby Bearhug, was much more of a success physically, as the experiment was able to walk and move unlike Bobby, and they even successfully got Catnap to speak by giving him a voice box. However, in experimentation, it did break, and as a consequence, he had a deep, scary voice. Although, that was far from his only problem, because mentally, he had a whole new set of issues. For one, he almost immediately showed that he didn't like being experimented on one bit, as when trying to contain him for a little bit inside of the labs and study him before being implemented into Playcare, he displayed extreme aggression and even found a way outside of his cell, attacking and killing 6 scientists working down there. This was all reported on by one otherwise meaningless scientist among all of the others, Preston Willard, who saw firsthand how aggressive Catnap and the experiments in general were becoming, and begged the company to be safer with experimentation to ensure nothing like this could happen again. This moment wouldn't lead to anything catastrophic for now, but it quietly led to Preston being overwhelmed with guilt for what he was doing down here and how dangerous it was, which began to weigh on him over the coming years. Anyway though, Catnap would be calmed down after going through Miss Gracie's brainwashing tapes, and his aggression was mostly ironed out following this, allowing him to be moved into Playcare mostly successfully. As while the children at first found him to be a bit creepy, they warmed up to him over time and started to like him, allowing the scientists to both create the rest of the Smiling Critters and fix the previously failed ones to roam Playcare, also creating a little prison inside of the playhouse to store them safely at night. However, there still was one other issue with Catnap, being that whenever he was placed inside of a room with Experiment 1006, the prototype, he acted strange around him, as he would follow the prototype around like a lost puppy, despite 1006 not really seeming to show any emotion towards it. This worried Leith Pierre, who first pointed this stuff out, since it displayed, like his child version, Catnap was highly impressionable, especially when it came to anything the prototype says or does, which could be a problem in the event he might have been told to do something violent. For now, though, that was that. One other unrelated experiment they would eventually develop for Playcare was a bigger body of Chum Chompkins, who they had created with the hope of using his mouth as a hiding pod for the children to relax inside of. This didn't work, as the children were horrified when put inside, so he mostly was a failure, although not much is documented on the beast outside of that. Another interesting experiment around this point was Experiment 1199, which was one of Playtime Co's many attempts at still trying to create smaller, toy-sized experiments. However, this time to do this, they actually tried experimenting on an adult, Thomas Clark, because since starting with the factory, he ended up getting lung cancer and therefore actually volunteered to be experimented on, which sadly was as well pretty unsuccessful, as the Brawn toy could barely show any signs of even being alive, and after trying to store him with some of the other experiments, they grew violent since they recognized that he was an employee and one of the ones responsible for turning them into experiments, so they attacked him, forcing the employees to store him away all alone, while also making it evident to them that over time the experiments were starting to get angry. Regardless though, they didn't really care, and another child Playtime Co was interested in inside of Playcare was named Marie Payne, a girl that, like some of the children outside of the factory, responded especially badly to the red smoke, having intense nightmares at night where her skin went pale, her heart went crazy, and she was hot to the touch. This led to them wanting to experiment on her, but this time they had an interesting idea, being that they wanted to turn her into something completely new. A never-before-seen toy named Mommy Longlegs, a pink spider-like being, testing out a new idea for what they called elastic plastic, a way to essentially make a toy super stretchy. And as an experiment, this physically worked out super well, as Mommy could actually talk by moving her lips and walk around like a full-blown spider, even being able to use the new plastic technology to stretch out her hands super far. Now, like all of the other experiments, she did have some flaws of her own, specifically around her relationship with the employees, because with her once being a child in Playcare, she felt extreme rage towards the workers that made her this way, kind of like the toys from the Brawn experiment. However, she would actively go out of her way to attack them on sight. At the same time though, ironically like a mother, Mommy loved and nurtured the children of Playcare when around them. Now, at first, the employees tried to calm this temper of Mommy's by creating another experiment that was just a male version of her named Daddy Longlegs, like what they did with Huggy, but she ended up just killing him, so that was unsuccessful, and instead, they decided the best way to make use out of this monster was to just move her over into the game station that was purely inhabited by the children and let her take care of them herself, while the scientists simply observed from 20 yards away, which led to her actually being quite successful as an experiment. So much of a success that when the company was trying to find a flagship toy to sell to the public using the elastic plastic technology, at first they had an idea for an orange stretchy robot toy of some kind, but ended up just settling on selling an action figure of the Mommy bigger body, along with a daddy and baby Longlegs, which was a great idea and sold quite well. Now, at this point, the factory was bouncing back thanks to Harley Sawyer and the bigger body bodies a success. Money was being saved, and it felt like they might have finally made it past the public scandals from the end of the last decade. However, there quickly started to be a new problem they didn't consider, which was that only a small number of employees actually ever knew about the experimentation going on in the factory, and a growing fear was that an angry or unsuspecting employee could dig around the place when they weren't supposed to and find something they maybe shouldn't have. Now, their first encounters with dysfunctional employees mostly started small. For one, there was a somewhat unknown worker named Patty Hall, who in January of 1991 intentionally sabotaged a paint machine, seemingly just to mess with the company, leading to them sending her down to a place named Storage B to, quote, receive further instructions, whatever that means. While one of the warehouse employees, Rich, was getting frustrated with the company's incompetence himself when having to sort through a bunch of the orphanage junk to find Huggy boxes, something they would catch him complaining about on a security camera before then demoting him to the rejected toys room to deal with all of the broken toys, which frustrated him even further and would lead to him hating the company. That would be until one day when he was working with the head of shipping, Stuart, where while going into Playcare, he opened up to Stuart about his anger towards the company and how upset he was with the state of specifically the Playtime orphanage, wishing the children inside would be able to go outside, like for real, not in a dome. Stuart could see the good man in the otherwise temperamental Rich and decided to give him a chance. Stuart was near retirement, so he selected Rich to be his replacement as the head of shipping when finally retiring, giving Rich some hope that not everybody in this company was just bad people, and finally making him happy. Now, with both of these dysfunctional employees seemingly dealt with positively, you'd think the lower down employees would no longer be a problem. However, this was actually just the beginning, as things would get a whole lot worse when on March 21st of 1991, Playtime Co's worst nightmare came true. In a report, the lower down employee, Marcus Brickley, claimed that he saw some kind of monster with 1,000 legs, referencing the bigger body for PJ Pugapillar that he spotted out by the cafeteria. Somebody on the outside had seen a moving experiment. Now, Marcus was obviously extremely shaken up by the incident, although thankfully, when bringing it up with Leith Pierre, he was kind of just told to F off and he listened, so no harm, no foul there. However, just a week later, on March 30th, a much more resilient employee had something to say. Rowan Stoll. Rowan, who worked as the head of the IT department, feared some kind of security risk when watching the eyes of Huggy Wuggy that looked a bit off. His main concern was that somebody might have secretly installed some kind of camera system to spy on the company, so he brought it up with Leith Pierre in a little VHS tape, thinking nothing too serious of it. However, after recording this, he kept investigating and discovered something horrifying. Huggy's eyes didn't look suspicious because they had cameras inside of them, but rather because the eyes were real organic eyes occupied by a real body inside of the statue. Once Rowan realized this, he knew he had to dig deeper, but also realized his horrible mistake with letting the company know he noticed the experiment. So he quickly sent over a follow-up VHS tape pretending to retract his worries and move on with his life. However, this didn't work, as Playtime Co. now saw him as a parasite inside of the company that needed to be removed before he discovered everything. Now, they couldn't just fire him or something like that, because then he would speak out against the company and potentially expose them. Rather, they somehow would need to make him disappear. And they first tried this by taking away his pension to get under his skin, before tampering with his car, leading to one of his tires flying off the interstate. state, hoping that he would die in a quote-unquote accident that he miraculously would survive. Anyway, when this stuff didn't work, they had to think of something fast, and quickly they turned to the first experiment they ever created, Boxy Boo. Boxy at this point didn't really have any specific use, despite being one of the better success stories of the Bigger Bodies initiative, and he was kind of just hanging out doing nothing. So, to address Rowan, Harley Sawyer thought to start tailoring Boxy's appetite specifically to human flesh, and teach Boxy to crave it. While this conditioning was going on, Rowan was very aware at this point that Playtime was trying to kill him, so he gathered as much information as he could about the experiments and the shady history of the company, uploading and releasing it all onto an FTP server during a security maintenance period, writing and sending out a letter to his mother with an IP address, hoping to allow her to access all of the files remotely before they found them. However, after sending all of this out and making one final VHS tape explaining this entire story, Rowan found himself going down to a storage room where none other than Boxy Boo was waiting for him. He investigated the box, but before he could do anything, Boxy jumped out and ate him, finally killing him and getting Rowan out of the way. At the same time, Playtime sent a document posing as Rowan, announcing that they would be sweeping through their entire database to presumably find and delete all of the files he uploaded, eliminating that threat successfully. However, regardless, this fear of somebody finding out about what was going on down here started to become a bigger and bigger concern as Sawyer kept producing more and more of these toys. In fact, a year later, in June of 1992, Huggy Wuggy, their golden child, broke free again despite fixing him like they thought. This time, he actually escaped the factory and began to attack and eat everything in the nearby forest. This included animals and, more tragically, multiple workers that tried to subdue him. Fortunately, they were able to stop Huggy outside of a house by tranquilizing him, just barely preventing what would have been a company-ending disaster. But one thing was made clear by this incident: the more experiments the company created, the more they were risking their reputation, especially as the toys seemed to be getting more and more aggressive, something that would need to be addressed soon. And speaking of aggression, Harley began to notice these angry traits as well with none other than Oliver, or the prototype, who, while studying, for the very first time would speak to him, not using his real voice, but rather mimicking the voices of all of the other employees around the factory, where he asked Harley a simple question.
I possess.
A question.
Go ahead.
Do you feel anything? You stick us,
Beat us.
tear at flesh.
Do you feel it?
He asked if Harley could feel anything, or if he had any kind of remorse for what he was doing to all of these innocent children he was using for the sake of progress. Harley, obviously being the cynic he was, didn't really seem to care, since after all, it was progress at all costs, remember? However, this would only agitate the prototype further, and he would begin to sabotage the employees in retaliation, attacking any worker that went near him, including in one incident, 1006, who had only become more and more intelligent over time, was able to turn the alarm clock in his observation room into a laser pointer and destroyed his camera, literally just so that an employee would have to enter and fix it, which would give him an easy kill. This led to scientists wanting to destroy the beast, especially with worries about how his intelligence and craftsmanship could affect them in the future, but his extreme intelligence rendered him valuable to Sawyer, so he let him live, although his anger and engineering skills aren't something to be forgotten, especially since he began to not just create things himself from other things, but he also began to add parts onto him, slowly making himself bigger and bigger over time. Although, I'll get back to this. From here towards the end of the year, things would honestly only get worse for the company, because in Christmas of 1992, a child outside of the factory named Jack, who was a fan of Playtime Co, would get himself a Doughy the Doughman action figure for Christmas, along with an invitation to visit and tour the Playtime factory. The following year, in 1993, Jack would end up going on his tour, but it was a complete disaster, as while in the section where the Doughy dough was produced, Jack got a bit too interested in the dough and accidentally fell over the observation railing he was watching from, causing him to fall into it and die. This had the potential to be the killing blow for Playtime, because now there was a real child casualty outside of the factory with video footage of it as well. If the public found out about this, it could easily lead to an investigation, which would cause all their secrets to be discovered. So quickly, they needed to find some way to sweep this controversy under the rug. And that's when they had the perfect idea. What if they used the body of Jack to turn him into a bigger body of his favorite toy, Doughy the Doughman, and save his life for the parents? Sound crazy? I know. But regardless, this is what they would end up doing. Granted, there was a little bit of a catch, because in order to make this massive dough character into a bigger body, it would have to be 900 total pounds. So to produce it, they would need to use 3 separate children and combine them to make the one body. They would begin the experiment named Experiment 1322 with Jack, of course, who they'd label as 1322A. Then they went into Playcare and studied various other children to become a part of this, settling on 2 others: Kevin Barnes, 1322B, and Matthew Hollard, 1322C. Kevin Barnes was a little bit of a worrying child, because he struggled to get along with others and was both aggressive and confrontational, even being labeled a quote-unquote problem child. However, they chose him because he excelled in all of the game station's tests, and so he was valuable in the eyes of Dr. Sawyer. While to hopefully balance this out a bit, they also added Matthew Hollard, who on the other hand was described as a dream child. He was known for being kind, considerate, and understanding, not being nearly as intelligent as some of the other children, but he was also far more mature, being one of the oldest children in Playcare at 15. Anyway, now that they had their 3 test subjects, they would combine all of them before Jack's parents would file any kind of police report for whatever reason. And together, they created Doughy, who was mostly a success in terms of physically being able to move, walk, and talk, even being able to shapeshift because of his malleable dough body. However, there was a big issue with his brain, being that he would often randomly bounce between acting like a young child with traits reminiscent of Jack, then he'd become aggressive like Kevin, and then he'd act more mature like Matthew. This chaoticness made his behavior a huge wild card, but nonetheless, they had him created and would send out a letter to Jack's family, inviting them over to the factory, claiming they saved him. Upon the parents entering the room with quote-unquote Jack, they realized he was turned into a living monstrous beast. The father was obviously horrified, while the mother tried to show compassion towards the monster, since after all, it technically was their son, right? Well, it didn't really matter, because obviously Playtime Co. didn't actually bring them here and show them one of their precious classified experiments for no reason. No, they wanted to silence the parents from speaking out against the accident they had witnessed. And now that they've seen a full-blown experiment, they couldn't escape alive. So the scientists shut and locked the door behind the parents, and after interacting with Doughy for a little bit, he quickly flipped to his aggressive and angry personality, leading to him attacking and eventually killing both of his parents. Although he did eventually snap out of it and saw what he did, causing him to burst into tears. Nonetheless, for Playtime, it was another close call. Although it wouldn't take long for there to be another big problem in the factory, this time surrounding Harley Sawyer. See, Harley was already growing controversial with the employees because his cynical attitude, which led to him being extremely rude and demanding, making strict remarks to workers that they were only, quote, one bad day away from catastrophe, even crashing out on employees for making a sandwich wrong. However, what he said in that letter was technically right. They were just one bad day away from everything falling apart, because at this point, there were literally hundreds of experiments created in the factory, and Harley really didn't have a good place to put them. They had built that little prison inside of the playhouse to store the 8 smiling critters, along with the little observation pods in the labs, which all worked well. But as for the rest, they kind of just roamed around the factory, which was super risky because there would be incidents like the Marcus Brickley one, where PJ Pugapillar was just caught roaming around the factory during late hours. So to solve this, Harley would look towards the Playtime Co theater, where he came up with a good idea. The theater was used to play shows for tour guests, with human beings playing as the toys. However, what if instead of using actors dressed up as monsters, they simply moved the unused experiments over into the backstage of the theater and used them to run the shows, having people believe they were just super realistic, kind of like the Huggy statue, not knowing they were really living. This would both save them on having to hire actors since the bigger bodies were free, and this would give them a good place to hide them backstage, since all they had to tell people was to not go backstage and spoil the magic. Nothing suspicious there. So Harley would end up doing just this, and while it might have seemed like a good idea on paper, something he clearly didn't consider is what would happen if the experiments were to potentially throw any of their fits while performing. And while soon he wouldn't have to wonder, because at some point in 1993, during one of these theater performances, this very worry would happen, as one or multiple of the experiments would go on a rampage, attacking and destroying the theater, catching it on fire in the process, and most devastatingly, leaving 66 separate visitors to the factory dead, along with presumably many other guests witnessing the event and surviving. Following this incident, which they dubbed the theater incident, Jared Lockhart was assigned to investigate and find out what happened, while a group of resource extraction specialists were formed to go digging around and assess the damage, with 12 of them also dying in the aftermath. Anyway, after collecting evidence and digging through everything, one thing became immediately clear: that this was all the fault of Harley Sawyer and his negligence. And once the higher-ups got word from Jared that the blood was on Harley's hands, they realized that they could no longer let this man stick around. There were plenty of close calls before this, but now dozens upon dozens of people from the public were dead, and at best, the factory's reputation was completely ruined. Now, I can only assume the factory wasn't completely shut down after this, because like I said, the bigger bodies were portrayed as being nothing more than actors, so it could have been painted as a terrible, terrible accident. But still, outside of the devastating reputational damage this must have caused, it also gave Playtime Co. and its higher-ups 2 huge new problems they needed to solve right now. 1, dealing with Harley Sawyer, and 2, dealing with all of the experiments that caused this. They couldn't just put them back here, because then something like this would just happen again. So what would they do? Well, first, regarding the rogue experiments, Playtime Co. decided to have Warrenbach Construction quickly build their very own dedicated prison, a place where they could put all of the misbehaving experiments while they were still being tested, instead of just leaving them out. Now, Warrenbach, for the first time, if you can believe it, was actually super against building this, as they finally realized that none of these weird things Playtime Co. was making them build were actually for the fun of children and for factory research, but rather this prison was indicative that there was some shady stuff going on here, and all of of this stuff was meant for something crazy. Regardless, they didn't really have a choice, being contractually obligated to build the prison, and so they obliged, constructing it on July 12th of 1993, along with building a secondary labs right next to it where they could more easily test the prison subjects, hiring out a warden to watch over the prison while also assigning the scientist Bruno White with running the secondary labs. As for Harley Sawyer, while they no longer wanted him around, they couldn't just kill him because, after all, he knew how to create the experiments better than anyone alive. And while they had their issues with Harley and his initiative, they knew that they needed to keep crafting these experiments for Playtime Co to keep turning a profit. So, going into 1994, they had come up with an idea to turn Harley into an experiment of his own, under the name Experiment 1354, the Doctor, planning to hook all of his vital body parts to Playtime Co's computer system right next to the secondary labs, allowing him to still live and talk. However, with no body, he wouldn't be able to disobey the factory. And from there, the relationship would be simple. The employees could go to Harley for advice on how to create the experiments, and he'd have to answer or else they'd unplug him. They had planned to operate on Harley in April of 1994. However, before commencing the experiments, Harley had sent over one final letter to Leith Pierre with a breakthrough, being that with there only being a limited number of orphans in Home Sweet Home to take from, running out of test subjects became a concern. However, Harley thought he had a solution for this problem as he was testing with neural mapping, where basically, in short, he thought it might have been possible to map and recreate the mind of one single individual, and then use that individual's brain data for multiple different experiments, essentially solving their problem. He would even create this mapping machine inside of the labs to collect this data and even revisit archived memories from other experiments. Now, while this technology had the potential to be revolutionary for Harley Sawyer, this gave scientist Bruno White an idea. To ensure nothing like a power outage or anything would accidentally kill Harley when he was turned into the computer system, they thought to revisit this neural mapping technology Harley was testing and would actually use it against him, mapping his mind to create a digital backup, while then finally experimenting on his real physical body to successfully turn him into his very own experiment, hanging on to the backup just in case. Obviously, Harley Sawyer was not a fan of this and was extremely frustrated.
From now on, you're here to give the lab boys answers when they need them, and carry out procedures when and how we tell you to. So fight, or give in, or whatever, because either way, we own the infrastructure you're wired into.
You'll die for this, Leaf. When I get my hands on you, you're a dead man!
But now, the higher-ups had all that they wanted, and Harley was reduced down to a computer with a graphic of an eye to represent himself. Alongside all of this, to ensure security in the factory further, the employees would develop the Omni Hand, a grab pack hand only given to Leith Pierre, Stella Graber, Eddie Ritterman, and the Warden, allowing them to open all of the company's most private areas, specifically down in the labs where their biggest secrets lie, along with building a safe room that they called the Safe Haven that contained a separate, completely off-the-grid electrical system that could only be managed by the Omni Hand, meant to give them a little place to hide in case another bigger incident happened and they needed somewhere to go camp out. Now, with all this being said, there was a little bit of a sad consequence of removing Harley Sawyer from the factory, being that since the Yarnaby experiment I mentioned earlier had been manipulated to grow super attached to him, with Harley no longer in the picture, Yarnaby became severely depressed and essentially immobile without his pal. With the removal of his master, 1166 appears lost. Despite Sawyer's apathy, the subject formed an attachment of sorts. Without whatever sense of comfort or stability that brought him, his motivation has been sapped. He sits, stares, listens, and only acts with aggression whenever I approach him. He truly just doesn't care anymore, said one of the scientists observing him. But moving on, around this time, there would be all sorts of other toy lines and experiments created, like the Wrong Side Outimals, a line of stuffed animals that were meant to be similar to the Smiling Critters. However, these toys' unique quirk was that they could be turned inside out to essentially create an entirely new plush. However, they weren't really liked by parents in focus groups, as they thought turning toys inside out was morbid and satanic, leading to it never releasing. However, some other toys that were conceptualized and existed around the time would be ones like Giblet, a heart-nosed fox, Lily Lovebrains, a humanoid doll with long purple hair, Glowbee, a toy pen that could write in invisible ink and then use the attached blacklight to illuminate the text, and Boogiebot, who was just an interactable little robot dude, some of which, like Giblet, would be turned into bigger bodies, among many more. They were even able to eventually successfully produce smaller living toys like they originally wanted from the start, although there isn't much known about how they did this and what they did with these smaller experiments. Anyway, for a short period of time, things were at least a little bit peaceful. There weren't any notable public crash outs or even really many notable experiments towards the later half of 1994, likely because down in the labs, at some point they would create a little facade they would call Sweet Street, a place that when containing a toy inside allowed them to more easily observe their behaviors in a natural environment, and found that the area actually helped to maintain their temper. The only other real thing worth noting around this period was that while expanding the factory more, the company attempted to pipe the red smoke from the gas production zone down deeper into the factory to places like the prison to make the experiments of that area fall asleep. However, something they didn't find out till after the fact was that the red smoke was actually extremely flammable, and one accidental spark could set it all on fire. That's possibly why the theater ended up catching fire during the theater incident. So, down towards the prison, they began to store all sorts of liquid nitrogen canisters used to keep things cool and avoid sparking to prevent the factory from suddenly catching fire and blowing up. However, while this was all happening, something else was brewing, specifically with none other than the prototype, who at this point had built his body up so much using leftover parts around the factory and adding them onto himself that he developed from just a small claw to a large, intimidating jester. This definitely made him look a lot scarier. However, at the same time, he also seemed to have developed a soft side, since eventually he and Poppy would end up acquiring a couple of Playtime phones that were connected to each other, allowing the prototype to talk to Poppy, the toy that he had wanted to meet all those years ago. Using the phone, despite the prototype building himself into this monstrous, intimidating beast, to Poppy, he was finally able to lift the mask and just told her that his name was Oliver, or rather, Ollie, as Elliot would call him, mimicking a child's voice to seem just like a friend. Poppy would cope with who she thought was just another child and not the prototype about the new state of the factory. She once saw it as this amazing place where everybody was and would be happy, but now it was in this diminished state. And furthermore, the years of employees continuing to take her apart to study her had driven her insane. At first it hurt, but by now she had lost the ability to even feel it. She once felt human, but now she felt nothing. Ollie would comfort her on the phone during these moments, and eventually she even began to grow attached to him, treating him like a friend during these dark times. However, this all only made the prototype angrier, because now not only was he angry at the factory for taking his life away from him, but the one thing that he was sacrificed for in Poppy was being used and abused torturously. At this point, the prototype knew he needed to put an end to things, and soon. So when he could, he would interact with all of the other toys and try to get them on his side, using his extreme intelligence, especially with toys like Catnap, to convince them to try and stop things with force, painting it as him saving them, as Catnap would describe it. This wouldn't work on all toys though, as eventually when word went around, Kissy Missy, who was originally seen as successful, started to have some severe problems, as after being transferred over to the prison to be investigated, they found that she was suffering from extreme anxiety and had, quote, an impending sense of doom. She would constantly rub her arms like something was bugging her, and the only way they could get her to calm down temporarily was to let her interact with the other toys. Eventually, they somewhat solved this problem by sending her over to Storage B, where she could work in a quieter, calmer setting, but that's all we really know. Regardless though, the prototype and his plan were going well. However, if he wanted to revolt against the employees, he knew that with him and all of the other toys being closely monitored and enclosed, it wouldn't just take convincing the monsters to help him end this, but he would also need help from an employee, and that's when he began to talk to Preston Willard. Preston, as I mentioned earlier, showed signs of guilt around experimentation while conditioning the Catnap toy, unlike any of the other scientists for the most part, and this guilt would begin to weigh on him more and more over time. He even began to set up talks with one of the higher-up employees, Stella Graber, who also had a heart for the children and wanted to save them, to discuss some kind of solution. This all made Preston specifically the perfect target for the prototype. 1006 convinced Preston that he knew a way to stop the Bigger Bodies initiative once and for all, and all Preston would have to do is just let him free. Preston, Stella, and the prototype would talk among each other for a while going into 1995, and eventually they had selected a date to finally end this initiative for good. August 8th of 1995 at 11 a.m., calling it the Hour of Joy. Preston also would begin to write down as many notes as possible in his employee orientation notebook, logging down and setting the record straight about what actually happened in this factory in the event somebody found it in the future. So the date was set. In the months leading up to this event, the employees could tell that something was off about the factory. Tensions felt higher, and they got a sense that this factory wouldn't last with the production of all of these experiments down here forever. And if Playtime Co. were to still exist for years to come, they would need to expand outside of this building, both to help the company grow further and also to get out of here in time before the worst could happen. This is when they would work on some brand new quote-unquote projects outside of the factory. One named Project Broader Horizons, one in Japanese that translates to Project New Beginnings, and Project Garden World Play Park. The first project there isn't much known about outside of that it was meant to take place in the US, while for the other two, Project Garden World Play Park was supposed to be some kind of Playtime Co. theme park similar to like Disney World, and the Japanese project New Beginnings was apparently meant to be an entirely new factory that took place overseas, which in particular was a good idea because it would allow the company to move to a country that was never familiar with any of Playtime Co.'s products and therefore controversies, giving them a fresh start and a way to continue experimentation outside of the limited confines of one location. The company needed to rush this stuff out the door fast before anything happened, so right away they first began production of the play park, which fortunately it wouldn't take too long, while they also in July of 1995 prepared to send over everything they would need to farm and produce poppy flowers and gel over to Japan to ensure they could continue experimentation overseas, while also being sure to remind everybody to not let Rich hear any word about this. And this is because moving into early August of 1995, the top-level employees began to have an issue with none other than the new head of shipping I mentioned earlier in this video, Rich Levitz. In the years since getting this higher-up position, Rich's attitude heavily changed. He once was the grumpy, angry man who hated the factory, but since had grown into being much kinder and therefore loved by the other employees. They saw him as a ground root story of somebody from the bottom finally rising to the top, and they would look to him as an inspiration. Furthermore, unlike all of the other higher-up employees who were super mysterious or arrogant, Rich was much more vocal, specifically when it came to the flaws of the company. He would talk and mentor younger workers in shipping and would blatantly call out the company for being, quote, far from angelic. He was a realist, and this made him likable by the lower down employees, as I said, but this was something the higher ups would absolutely hate, as they now feared that a person of authority could lead the lower down employees into suspicion around the company's morals, which could cause them to do worse at work, or even worse, the main fear was that they could potentially start sniffing around and would discover the experiments. They needed a way to silence Rich. At this point, though, there wasn't much they could do. They couldn't make him disappear like Rowan or experiment on him like Harley, because at this point, that would only turn him into a martyr and lead to all of the other employees getting even more suspicious of the factory. Fortunately, though, in a phone call between Eddie and Leith, they had come up with a perfect idea to actually promote Rich even further from the head of shipping to one of the heads of the entire company up with them. Not because they actually liked or cared for Rich in any reasonable way, but rather they thought that if they treated him like an executive, then the lower down employees would think that he sold his soul and became one of the elites. It was a perfect plan, and they were ready to give this an attempt, although it would be up to Leith to do it alone, since Eddie had to take a work trip from the 7th of August to the 12th to inspect the Playtime Park and see how it was going, since at this point the park was about ready to open and they even began advertising it around the factory. So Eddie would leave on August 7th, but the next day would mark August 8th, the Hour of Joy Day. This day started mostly normal for the factory, as if it were any regular day. The only notable thing going on here was that the scientists had planned to take Kissy Missy out of Storage B and try transferring her over to Playcare to potentially interact with the children. However, while doing this, the clock would strike 11 a.m. And this was when Preston would finally free the prototype and all of the other experiments, where, to his shock, nearly every single one of them attacked any and all humans they could find. All of the employees, all of the visitors from the tours, even Thomas Clark was caught up with and killed. No human, except for the Playcare orphans, was spared. They even went out of their way up in the prison to take some of the security guards and lock them inside of their own prison cells just to be able to hear them suffer slowly while they died. This attack lasted for an entire hour, and one of the most notable parts was when the warden of the prison was trying to make a run for an exit, he had actually ran past Harley Sawyer. Now, Harley, who was connected to the entire Playtime Co computer system, actually had offered the warden a deal. He was in possession of the Omni Hand, which allowed the owner not just the ability to open any high-level door like I mentioned, but also it had another another feature, which was that it let the owner use the accompanying Omni chip to open doors remotely. So quite simply, Harley offered to open up an exit for the warden if he simply handed over the hand and chip. The warden, in a panic, agreed. However, perhaps as expected, Harley didn't live up to the deal and didn't free the warden, leading to him dying. But now, most importantly, this gave Harley the ability to control the entire factory. At least that is, except for the safe haven, which wouldn't actually be inhabited by employees running from the hour, but rather it would be taken over by some of the toys. These include all sorts of smaller experiments not involved with the Hour of Joy, and even some larger ones like Doughy the Dough Man. Now, they couldn't access the interior of the backup generator without the Omni Hand in case anything went wrong, but for now, it was a safe place for them to hang out. Someone less lucky would be a second Kissy Missy experiment living in the prison named Riley, who was originally brought into Playcare less than a year ago in August of 1994 after losing her family in some kind of fire. When noticing in the orphanage that various members of Playcare were being quote-unquote chosen under the assumption they were being adopted, she would be excited when one day she would be chosen. Although this excitement very quickly dissipated when, to her surprise, being chosen meant that she would be put under and experimented on, leading to them turning her into a Kissy Missy toy, living inside of one of the prison cells for examination. This mortified her, but fast forwarding to the present Hour of Joy, she finally was able to leave her cell, and to her shock, she found that there were all sorts of dead bodies that looked just like her. Realizing over the next few hours that the factory had been completely destroyed and taken over, giving her no way out, she was left with no choice but to go out on her own terms, stealing the key to the prison's train station so nobody could ever return, and hiding in her cell until she died of starvation. But now that the hour had happened and almost all of the employees were dead, the prototype had freed all of the toys from their control. However, this was far from all that the prototype wanted, because something he didn't exactly tell the toys initially was that he didn't kill all of the employees simply to let the toys free, but rather he wanted to take control of them himself. He would tell all of the toys that they wouldn't be allowed to leave the factory, and would take all of the remaining orphans who were not targeted by the Hour of Joy and brought them down to the labs, containing them in what he called, quote, the better place, where he and the orphans would call home, although I'll touch more on this place here in a moment. Back up above, as for all of the remaining bigger bodies, the prototype would gather everyone that he could find and force them to work under his rule, or else. His first goal with gathering this group was to force them to go looking around for any surviving employees that might have been hiding out. The toys a part of this group that we know include the experiment version of Giblet, Chum Chompkins, Huggy Wuggy, one of the Nightmare Critter experiments, Baba Chops, Kissy Missy, and even all of the Smiling Critters' bigger bodies. They would search around the labs, finding as many bodies as they could before killing them, and while some of them believed that this was for the greater good and they were finally getting revenge on the employees that tortured them for so many years, there were some that enjoyed it a lot less and were clearly being forced to do this under threat of the prototype harming them. Giblet, for instance, couldn't bring himself to kill anybody, so he kind of just tied them up and that's all. Other toys like Kissy Missy and Hoppy Hopscotch would obey the prototype's orders temporarily, but would attempt and successfully escape his wrath, finding refuge in the safe haven. However, nonetheless, the cult kept searching for survivors, and eventually they were attempting to find two scientists that were still missing. Dr. Preston Willard, the one that started the Hour of Joy, and Dr. Jessica Newman, one of his co-workers. They also would supposedly at one point or another link up with Marcus Brickley, although what happened to him isn't really ever mentioned. They had both been hiding out in the labs without ever being spotted, outside of actually running into the Poppy Playtime doll, who was roaming about a few days after the incident on August 12th, and unlike the others, appeared far more traumatized and spared the scientists, promising to not report them to anybody. However, she also said that there'd be, quote, consequences if the prototype found out about what happened, so she simply just pretended she never saw them. Otherwise, Poppy kept searching for refuge herself, and as for the two scientists, they found a newer, more secure hiding spot, where Jessica was originally optimistic that somebody would eventually be sent over soon to let them out, but over time, that hope started to wane more and more. And as for Preston, he quickly started to feel super guilty about what he did. As the days passed on, this guilt consumed him, and he chose to come clean to Jessica that he was the one that let the experiments out the whole time. Upon revealing this information, this sparked an explosive argument between the two, and quickly, as they raised their voice, none other than Huggy Wuggy heard and found them, breaking down their hiding spot and forcing them to run. Fortunately, both of them escaped, at least from Huggy. However, unfortunately, Preston, while running, would end up bumping into Chum Chompkins, who would take his body and bring him over to the prototype. As for Jessica, though, after cooling off a little bit, she searched around the labs, trying to meet back up with Preston, since after all, it was her only friend down here. Eventually, she ended up finding an apology letter from him, saying sorry for everything he did and had to do, along with his name tag, which he would place back on his desk. Regardless, she kept searching for Preston while seemingly being stalked by Catnap. And eventually, when going down a flight of stairs, she was jumped by none other than the prototype, who had now tracked her down and eventually stopped her, taunting her a little bit before doing what he did to all of the other offending employees by killing her. As for Preston, though, the prototype liked him enough at least to not kill him, since after all, he was the one that let him out. So instead, the prototype attempted to let him live an immortal life and experimented on his body. And using all sorts of toy parts he found around the factory, he turned Preston into this horrific primitive experiment, reminiscent of the incognizant Thomas Clark toy from all those years back, that was alive, although clearly 1006 wasn't much of a pro at making experiments, at least yet. This isn't all for the remaining employees hiding around that the prototype wanted to find, though, as he still hadn't been able to locate maybe his least favorite employee of them all, Gracie Green, the one that ran the Miss Gracie conditioning tapes. If there was anyone who did the most harm to the children in the factory, it had to be her, as she was literally in charge of brainwashing their delicate minds. After searching around for her for a little bit, eventually a bunch of the critters had found her hiding behind a barricaded door. She, unlike the others, was actually in contact with the outside world, trying to get help from somebody named Todd. However, before long, the door was broken down and she was captured. Now, like Preston Willard, the prototype actually didn't want to kill her. However, unlike Preston, it was because he hated her so much that he wanted to torture her mind in the same way that she did to the children. So he looked around and eventually found some experiment plans for a never created experiment that was meant to be a bigger body of Lily Lovebraids. And following these guidelines, he turned Gracie into this very experiment. However, not only did he experiment on her, but he also had locked her away inside of one of her own conditioning rooms, playing the Miss Gracie tapes on loop, forcing her to be brainwashed by her own video. He provided her with food and drink so that way she wouldn't die, purely because he wanted to see her go completely mad, and that she did. Over the next 400 days, she would begin to lose her identity as a human, Gracie, and would completely morph herself into having the bubbly and friendly personality of Lily Lovebraids, completely forgetting her past identity. After this, for spatial reasons that aren't really ever clarified, the prototype moved her out of the conditioning room, but he definitely wasn't done with her, as he threw her inside of Sweet Street, specifically inside of the house, leaving her all alone, where quickly she went completely mad. Since not remembering her old identity, she became confused and frustrated with why nobody, especially the prototype, wanted to visit her. It led to her making her own fake friends and constantly living in fear that she was a quote-unquote bad toy, and that's why she wasn't liked. But that's jumping ahead. One other employee who the prototype and his group actually couldn't find was none other than the head of shipping, Rich Levitz, who after his promotion had taken some time off away from work, and therefore, like Eddie Ritterman, he missed the hour of joy. And upon hearing about the disappearance of all of his coworkers, he was completely devastated, as well as super curious as to what might have happened to them, especially since he was already very suspicious of Playtime Co. Nonetheless, though, for now, he would attempt to stay away from the place and keep it out of his thoughts. Going back to the prototype's cult, eventually 1006 went completely mad for power, as his greatest follower, Catnap, began to truly treat him and his cult like it was a full-blown religion, building a shrine for him with candles and scratching words in the wall, everything. While at the same time, one of the critters who tried to go against the cult was the bigger body of Dog Day. He originally pretended to be on the prototype side, however, unlike the others, he ended up being caught as being a traitor and was therefore tortured for his disobedience by being strung up inside of the Playhouse prison and was forced to sit there while hundreds of mini critters crawled up and ate him alive, presumably along with any of the other critters that tried the same thing. Although one experiment that was actually spared from the cult in its harsh ways was one of the Miss Delight dolls, who after the hour of joy was mysteriously locked inside of the school with all of her sisters. And while at first she attempted to defend them by crafting a weapon out of rulers and pencils that she called a barb in the event that whoever locked them inside chose to show themselves, as time passed and they all began to get hungrier and hungrier, it didn't take long for them to single her out as their next potential meal. The only reason they didn't eat her was because, due to lack of energy, she just played dead on the floor like she had already starved to death, so they left her alone. Although at this point, all of this had driven her so insane that her face began to disintegrate down to flesh, and she even began talking to her own weapon, Barb, who convinced her that if she wanted to live, she would have to kill her own sisters for food, which tragically she did, leading to her surviving, but at the cost of all of her companions. Nonetheless, eventually the door finally opened, and upon investigating, it turns out it was actually Catnap that closed it on her, where despite her quite valid frustration with him, he offered her a deal: protect the school from any wandering employees, and they'd let her live. This is also presumably what they did with other toys like Mommy Longlegs in higher parts of the factory, who watched for any intruders in exchange for getting to survive outside of the cult. So now at this point, the prototype seemed like he had everything that he could have ever wanted. However, he was still missing one thing: Poppy. After successfully taking over the factory and most of its toys, he still heavily desired to reunite with Poppy, hoping to finally meet her after all of these years. So he searched for her for a while and even was able to track her using the phone, since of course at this point she thought the prototype and Ollie were two different people. So while trying to avoid the prototype, she would talk to Ollie and reveal her location. Eventually he figured out that Poppy had actually made her way up with a lot of the other toys inside of Safe Haven. They would all hang out together for a while in here and try to make some kind of new life among the rubble. However, with the prototype's prized possession, the Poppy doll, being inside of here, he and his cult would begin to attack the safe haven and its toys, trying to find their way inside to capture Poppy. The safe haven toys would fight back, and eventually this buildup would lead to the start of the 1997 Toy War, where both sides, the prototype's new rule and Poppy's rebellion, would violently fight against each other for control. Now, honestly, very little is known about the specifics of this war or what exactly happened during it, but what we do know is that it quickly started to weigh heavily on one member of Safe Haven, Poppy. Poppy was quick to panic under stress, so after listening to the constant battling happening around Safe Haven, she was so freaked out that she decided she needed an escape, and one day would end up leaving the Safe Haven to go inside of the one place where she felt safe, her old room by Elliot's office. She would stay here for a little bit, but again, using the phone, it wouldn't take long for the prototype to find her inside. Now, you'd expect 1006 to want to kill her for being a part of this rebellion. However, he actually chose to speak with her.
Here you are, hiding in your room, running away from the rebellion you started.
She begged him to stop all of this and to let the orphans go, pleading with him that killing her wouldn't stop the war and that nobody needed to die for either of them. But the prototype didn't want to kill her. In fact, he saw her as extremely valuable. They were the original 2 experiments created by Elliot and were absolutely perfect and therefore immortal experiments that wouldn't age away like the rest of the factory over time and lack of resources. So he didn't want her dead, but rather wanted her to join him in his better place. He revealed to her that he couldn't let the orphans go because without them, they'd be left all alone in this factory for a miserable infinite experience. But clearly, according to the prototype, Poppy didn't understand how painful loneliness was. So, to show her an example, the prototype would take her and would lock her inside of a case, up in her room where nobody would see her, visit her, or interact with her.
I know one way to make you see this.
Painting an entire red poppy flower mural with all sorts of messages telling anybody that could have encountered it to turn around, hoping to show her how dark loneliness can truly be. Now, at this point, it seemed like the prototype truly had everything he ever could have wanted. He had ruled at least most of the factory and was borderline its god, and both Poppy and the orphans were secured for his immortal future. Although during this, something that the prototype was well aware of was that while him and Poppy could ideally live forever together, the orphans he wanted to keep them company could not. They were human beings, and therefore, if he wanted to keep them around here with them, he would have to figure out how to create perfect immortality himself, like what Elliot once did, and experiment on the orphans. However, evidently, he was no professional when it came to experimentation at this point, having to follow the guides of the scientists to produce Lily Love braids, and having a lot less success when trying on his own with Preston. But up at the prison, he knew Harley Sawyer was still living among the Playtime computer system, the man with more knowledge about the experiments than anyone alive. So he would go up there and use Harley in the same way he was used back when the factory was open. The prototype consulted Harley for advice on how to make the experiments under threat of destroying him. Harley would comply, and slowly the prototype would begin experimenting himself, attempting to create immortality of his own using the remaining orphans humans as test subjects. He, like the scientists, would document these experiments under his own number system. And by experiment number 4, he wasn't very successful, as he originally tried reviving them using the poppy gel independently without the negation formula to stop it, which led to the experiment overgrowing, causing the stitching to unravel and the entire being's body spilling onto the table as it breathed. By experiment number 8, he attempted to fully submerge the experiments in the poppy gel, making the body easier to mold. By experiment 15, he was finally able to create a fully moving and living experiment. However, upon applying the negation formula to stop the poppy gel's growth, he accidentally overapplied it and therefore dissolved all of the muscle, bone, and growth medium. By experiment 28, he had seemingly found a good balance between the gel and the negation formula, creating a fully conscious being that could talk. He identified himself as her giver and identified her as a girl named Gabby, although sadly after that she would die. By experiment 34, he finally produced a fully independent, living, breathing, walking, and talking experiment. Despite this, he still considered himself far from the goal of infinite life, and it's presumed after this he would continue experimenting and perfecting these things to try and make them more like himself. Plus, while it's not very well documented, at some point around this time, the prototype would also begin experimenting on already living toys, specifically problematic toys that he wanted to punish by taking their bodies and then turning them inside out to hopefully teach them a lesson about going against the prototype's rule, turning them into these morbid, disturbing denizens, one of the victims of which even being the bigger body of Giblet. Possibly because behind the scenes, Giblet would secretly join the fight against the prototype alongside the bigger body Chum Chompkins and would befriend the people of Safe Haven like Dowie to presumably help them. These denizens that he called Outimals, inspired by the Wrong Side Outimals, would live down below the factory in Anarchy. And interestingly, they would sustain themselves by feeding large amounts of food to this bigger body brawn that would half digest the food into slop that they could eat from a hole in his stomach. So pretty weird. Life was horrifying in the factory going into the 2000s. The Safe Haven inhabitants were terrified about Poppy's disappearance and would draw on the walls begging for her to come back, along with painting murals documenting the war that went on around them. Eventually, to try and help out during these trying times, they would start running expeditions outside of Safe Haven, where they would attempt to bring supplies up to Playcare to help sustain some of their allies, like Dog Day. However, these were pretty risky, and in one expedition from February 9th of 2001, a bunch of toys, including Hoppy Hopscotch, got jumped by the outside creatures. And eventually, in one of these expeditions, Hoppy suffered an injury bad enough that it caused her to tragically pass away. As for the Safe Haven's leader, Dowie, while he was by far the most powerful and had no problems physically, mentally he struggled quite a bit, as he'd randomly, mysteriously leave Safe Haven and travel all the way to the top of the factory just to look at the exits and imagine all the possibilities. He knew he could make it out alive if he truly wanted to, but he also knew he'd be abandoning the friends at Safe Haven that saw him as a leader. Fortunately for them though, Dowie would always come back down and stick with them through thick and thin. Over on the side of the prototype, while working with Harley Sawyer, he would end up accidentally uncovering the backup to the doctor's mind that was archived by Playtime Co. Now, as cool as this was, the prototype actually found this as being pretty dangerous, because with it containing the intelligent mind of Harley Sawyer, that means that if somebody found it, they could have used it to figure out how to create these experiments themselves, and more specifically, how to create things like the negation compound, that, as we saw in his past experiments, would degrade all biological matter it touched, including that of already living beings, which would give him a huge weakness if somebody were to discover it. At the same time, though, he didn't want to destroy the backup because it was far too valuable of information to just get rid of. So he would store it all the way down in the Playtime Co data center by the labs, where hopefully nobody that wanted to harm him would find it. Moving forward a bit, by 2003, the only real notable thing to have happened was rumors started to circulate that after the Hour of Joy, 23 different toys called the Joyless, led by a toy named Gentle John, had apparently found their way up and out of the factory, escaping the prototype's cult. He obviously didn't like this, and didn't want any other toys to get the same idea, so he would go around the factory interrogating any toys that knew about this incident, and to silence them, he would kill them. While at the same time, the members of the prototype's cult would create a newsletter called A Better Press, where the prototype would have them release all sorts of propaganda. For instance, he had them make up a story that the rumored escapees were found dead in a fire in the innovation wing, while also saying that his enemies in Safe Haven were supposedly starting to eat each other, hoping to keep anybody from joining their side. Now, otherwise, the prototype's plans continued to go well, and going into 2004, it seemed like he was on the verge of winning the toy war against the Safe Haven, as the room was having some problems with the generator, which began to malfunction. Now, this normally wouldn't be a big problem because Dowie was able to easily collect all the parts he needed to fix it. However, to access the generator, the Omni Hand was required, with the only known one still in existence owned by Harley Sawyer, who at this point, while it's not known how, had developed hundreds of robotic minions of his own to live up in the domain that he could transfer his mind onto, making him a very powerful source. Or in other words, they had no real way to access it without risking death. In December of 2004, they even began trying to find new places to hide to desperately find an out from the prototype, and although the ally Giblet would suggest that they come down to the recycling area in the labs where he was stationed, they wouldn't end up doing so, and by 2005, things had reached the end of the line. The enemy toys had completely surrounded the safe haven, and while the members would attempt to place traps to stop them, the prototype had figured out how to get past all of them and would menacingly wait outside of their door, tapping on it. With the reality that Safe Haven was on the ropes and could be breached at any moment, one of the inhabitants had a crazy idea: Kissy Missy. She had known about the employee Rich, who survived the Hour of Joy and was out there somewhere, giving her the idea to call for him for help. So, Kissy, using her primitive drawing skills, wrote a little letter and exited the safe haven to go outside and send it, hoping that Rich would respond. Going outside of the factory to Rich's residence, since the Hour of Joy, he just wanted to forget about the factory. He had no idea where any of his coworkers had gone, nor did he think he'd ever see them again, and the survivor's guilt of being one of the only people to make it out alive weighed on him heavily, and there was nothing he could do about it. That was until he got a package at his door, featuring a VHS tape for the Poppy Playtime doll and a letter that said there were still co-workers alive in the factory, directing him to the flower mural by Poppy's room. Getting this letter meant everything to Rich because it meant he could finally get some answers to what happened to the factory and the employees. Maybe some were alive like the letter suggested. Either way, out of both curiosity and guilt, Rich would make his way 10 years later to the Playtime factory to explore and see what he found inside. Starting the plot of the main game, where Rich is the player, who for now I'll just refer to as us. Upon entering the factory, at first everything looked exactly how we expected it to. Everything was abandoned, broken toys lied everywhere, and it was extremely silent. However, when grabbing a grab pack and entering the lobby, we saw none other than Huggy Wuggy. We tried to ignore the statue, but eventually it completely disappeared, and we realized it was one of the experiments that still lived. From here on our journey, we saw the experiment sneaking around like it was trying to hunt us, and after moving throughout the factory some more, we eventually made it to the Make a Friend machine, collecting a Catbee plush to enter the next room. But this is when Huggy finally pounced on us, chasing us into the nearest vent. After running from the beast for a little bit, we ended up narrowly making it out and dropped a box on Huggy, dropping him down the catwalk area to his presumed death, which conveniently landed us right next to the flower room we were sent here to find. We approached and entered the mysterious room to find that the entire place was themed like a house. As strange as this was, we continued down, and at the end were some wooden doors that, when opening, revealed none other than Poppy, locked inside of a case. Naturally, we finally opened the door, and after multiple years of being stuck, Poppy was free. After waking up from a sleep caused by all of the Poppy scents built up in that case, we exited the room and entered Elliot Ludwig's office. After exploring around a bit, we finally met back up with Poppy, who seemed super optimistic and had a mission for us to complete, which was to go down to the game station and activate the train to find an escape. We mindlessly obliged. However, what Poppy didn't tell us was that the game station was still inhabited by Mommy Longlegs, who, before Poppy could even finish talking to us, stole her and forced us to go and try to save her. Upon confronting Mommy, she knew that we wanted the train code, but before giving it to us, she wanted to get revenge. We were a former employee, so before getting the code, she forced us to play through the game station games ourselves, giving us little parts of the code for each game we beat. So that's exactly what we did. We went through Musical Memory and Whack-A-Wuggy without being attacked by the now hungry and vicious toys who occupied the area, although after surviving the first two mini games, Mommy kind of raged out a bit and actually killed Bunzo Bunny and the Wuggies. After completing those two mini games though, we found ourselves stuck behind a gate that we couldn't open from the outside. This was when none other than Kissy Missy was waiting for us, where she came up and opened the gate, allowing us to pass through. From here, we then made it to the final game, Statues, that after making it to the end of, we saw was completely blocked off, revealing that Mommy never actually intended for us to survive this challenge. Regardless, there was a grapple we could use to launch ourselves into the observation room, which thankfully meant we survived. But to Mommy, she considered that cheating. So she refused to give us the final piece to the train combo and instead attacked us, chasing us all around the factory until eventually she accidentally got herself caught up in a grinder, which we activated, killing her. But not before none other than the Prototype made his first appearance, reaching out and grabbing her body to eventually add onto his own. Anyway, we continued moving and found the final part of the train code along with rescuing the Poppy doll, allowing us to finally be done and escape, right? Well, not exactly. What Poppy didn't specifically say about all of this is that she had much bigger plans with us when finally getting on the train. So instead of helping us escape like we thought, she ended up changing the directions to none other than Playcare. Eventually, for better or worse, the train ended up crashing, which knocked us out. And while Poppy would end up running away before anything happened, this is when Playcare's main inhabitant, Catnap, would find us. To quickly dispose of us, he would dump us inside of Playtime Co's garbage disposal room, but thankfully we ended up waking up just in time and were able to escape this area before it closed in. After exploring the new area we were dropped into a little bit, we found a phone that on the line had none other than Poppy's quote-unquote friend, Ollie. Not knowing Ollie was actually just the prototype, we listened to him as a guide and made our way into Playcare. When entering, we listened to a little speech from Elliot about how much he cared about making people happy before inventing the Playcare, and then Ollie finally informed us why we were there, which was to make our way to the gas production zone where the red smoke was being created and redirect the gas down to the prison. However, when doing this, the power went out and it was our job to go inside Playcare's various different buildings and activate their backup generators. We aren't told exactly why we needed to do any of this, but once again, we oblige and make our way into the first building, Home Sweet Home, where the children slept. First, we are met with a ton of red smoke that we walk through, which causes us to fall into a nightmare of our own, where after walking through these long, deep hallways, we see writings on the floor that displayed we were feeling really guilty about our involvement with the factory. On radios lying around the area, we hear about the news report of the body of Oliver found in Elliot's home.
Tragic news this morning. As of 9:45 a.m., local authorities report that the body of a young boy has been found on the estate of the late Elliot Ludwig.
We even get to revisit our old desk from when the factory was still open. Nonetheless, we push further in this dream and eventually find ourselves stuck inside of a lab room, the place Playtime Co would work on these experiments, where, for a role reversal, an evil Huggy comes out of the TV and we become the victims, as he corners us and eats us, finally ending the dream. Once we woke up though, we continued our journey. Quickly, we saw that, like Huggy, Catnap was lurking around hunting us, but didn't strike yet. Regardless, we successfully powered on the Home Sweet Home generator and made our way out. When stepping outside, we are ambushed by none other than Kissy Missy, who had met back up with Poppy and attacked us out of pure fear after the hour of joy that clearly traumatized her. Anyway, with Poppy now back with us, she explained to us that the reason she dragged us down here in general was to defeat the prototype once and for all, since after all, they were the one keeping all of the toys down here and the one that needed to be killed to stop the war. Hearing this, we make our way into the Playcare school to power on the next generator, where we find Miss Delight. And like she agreed to, she tried to protect the school by attacking us when activating the generator. However, fortunately for us, we stayed resilient and escaped, shutting a door on her, killing her in the process. Next, after running into Catnap's prototype shrine, which he was actively praying to, we made our way to the playhouse, which was no longer inhabited by children, but rather hundreds of mini critters, where upon exploring, we see that every other smiling critter bigger body was now dead, except for Dog Day, whose body at this point was completely eaten from the hip down. He tried to warn us to leave as there was nothing left to save here. However, just seconds later, the mini critters came to finally finish him off, eating him from the inside out and possessing his body, before chasing us out of the playhouse and back into Playcare to enter the final destination, the counselor's office. Upon entering the office and activating the final generator, Catnap finally attacked, jumping us, sending the player into a second dream sequence where this time we imagine all of the children inside of Playcare before it was destroyed, even having a little flash to the hour of joy. This time when waking up, Catnap strictly tells us on the phone to leave. However, before doing that, we attempted to power on the gas production zone finally, only for Catnap to have enough and pounce on us in the process, chasing us up a lift where, after fighting off off Catnap for a while, we were able to activate a green hand charge, where we were given no other choice but to use the green hand of our own to charge it and then shoot it at Catnap, only for him to breathe out his red smoke, causing an explosion all over his body, burning every ounce of his hair off. The prototype came from above as Catnap once again got into a prayer position. However, for whatever reason, 1006 had had enough of him, stabbing and killing him before taking his body away as well. Anyway, we finally get to power on the gas production zone and send the gas down towards the prison. When getting on the lift to take us to the prison with Poppy while Kissy pulled the lever to let us down, as we got lower and lower, suddenly Kissy was attacked by the prototype, who tore her apart as well. Fortunately, once we reached the bottom, Poppy left us to search for the safe haven and went up to go save Kissy. We keep moving and eventually come across the toy graveyard, filled to the brim with piles upon piles of now dead toys. After passing through this area and reaching the train that takes us to the prison, we end up uncovering the now decaying body of Riley, holding the key to one of the doors that we took and used to enter the prison train. However, while waiting for it to start, we end up coming face to face with none other than Harley Sawyer, who all this time, as it turns out, has been watching over us and our journey through the Playtime cameras, and now was here, showing himself through one of the Playtime Co TVs. He taunts us for a little bit here, and then eventually, finally, drops us into the prison. We explore around a little bit while Harley continues to mess with us, doing things like locking us in one of the cell blocks that he filled up with red smoke until we narrowly escaped. Once making it out of the prison cell blocks, we go into an observation room where Harley reveals that he had since reunited with an old friend of his, Yarnaby, who he let out of containment to try and hunt us down. Anyway, we keep moving, sneaking around Yarnaby and even having to run from him when he eventually does spot us. But then, when entering a different observation room, we accidentally fall down and land defenseless in front of none other than Pianosaurus, who was still alive and quickly, like he did in the past, charged towards us, only for us to thankfully be saved last second by none other than Doughy the Dough Man, who introduces himself to us and directs us over to Safe Haven. However, on our way, we are dragged into a hiding spot by none other than Kissy Missy, who miraculously survived her attack from the prototype and had met back up with Poppy. However, the prototype was still hot on our tail, walking past our hiding spots until we quickly find an opening and exit and run into Safe Haven just in time. Here, Poppy finally explained to us how exactly she planned to kill the prototype, which was to use the red smoke that we directed down here to burn the entire factory down and kill the prototype. This was controversial with Doughy, since he knew to kill the prototype, they'd also have to kill every other toy in the process. Would it be worth it to sacrifice all of their lives to end the prototype's control and abuse? Well, for now, Kissy and Poppy stood by to be taken care of by the Safe Haven's medic, while Doughy briefs us with the current mission he needed us for, which was to acquire the Omni Hand from Harley Sawyer in order to repair the Safe Haven generator, or else risk the prototype breaking in and killing all of them. So we made our way out to the doctor's domain. However, before we could do so, out from the doors comes Yarnaby, who chased us down into a place called No Man's Land, forcing us to hide and power up and escape, which when doing successfully finally lets us kill Yarnaby by dropping him into some lava. Anyway, finally we were able to enter the doctor's domain, where once exploring a bit, he forced us to face off against his other pet, Baba Chops, who chased us through a room of cages with many other nightmare critters inside, until Harley eventually locked us inside of a room and gave us a very interesting interesting dilemma. To test our morals, we were given the choice to either stay inside of this room until we ended up dying, or we could simply kill this innocent Simon Smoke, also trapped within a tube, to be granted freedom. Where did our morals lie? Thankfully, this wouldn't really matter because we were able to find an escape through a hidden exit that he didn't consider. And finally, Harley would let us face off against him and his minions. And after running from them, thankfully surviving, we made it to the central part of his operation and took out the Omni chip, as well as finally deactivating the doctor once and for all. After recollecting the Omni hand, we made our way back to Safe Haven and finally fixed the generator. Our mission was complete with Dowie, although somewhat bittersweet. It was time to end everything with Poppy. She directed us over to the factory's foundation, where we found and placed dynamite all over it and made our way back over to finally set everything off. However, while doing so, Dowie approached us and realized that with both of us out here, nobody was watching for the prototype in Safe Haven, who, in between this blind period, had actually stolen all of our explosives and snuck into Safe Haven, blowing up absolutely everything and killing every single toy inside. After assessing the damage, we saw that there was nothing left but rubble, and Dowie was heartbroken. Here, we see him bounce wildly across his 3 personalities, saying it was his fault, and then ultimately deciding that it was actually our fault, causing him to shapeshift into a massive demonic salamander and chase us down. When fighting Dowie, we take advantage of the liquid nitrogen canisters left down here and exploded them onto Dowie, leading to his body freezing and allowing us to saw his otherwise malleable body down, taking us to a pressing room where we freeze him once more and finally crushed his body, causing him to sadly die, but not before finally snapping out of it and apologizing.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Anyway, after making our way through, we enter a little vent shaft and find that miraculously, Poppy and Kissy had snuck away from Safe Haven before it had blown up. However, at this point, the prototype was done pretending to be Ollie all these years for Poppy, and he revealed to her that this entire time, he actually always was 1006, telling her he was going to blow up the vent we were all hiding in, causing Poppy to run through a little exit, abandoning us and Kissy, while the prototype blew up the shaft, which thankfully both us and Kissy survived, but while trying to hold us up, Kissy's arm tore off and we fell below, separated from both of them. Now for the player, we did end up surviving this fall as well and found ourselves right outside of the lab's entrance, where using the Omni hand, we were able to enter. However, when doing so, we saw that from the outside, we had accidentally awoken a familiar beast, Huggy Wuggy, who had apparently survived his fall and now was repaired and ready to attack, banging on the glass and chasing us throughout the labs. The beast continually kept attacking us until we ended up making it into an elevator, where Huggy ambushed one more time and stole our grab pack, finally leaving us alone for a little while. On the other hand, for Poppy, after running throughout the vents from the prototype, who is now in full pursuit of trying to put Poppy back in her case, she thankfully managed to escape him. However, she only did this by accidentally falling through the vents, which landed her directly in front of none other than Lily Lovebraids inside of her dollhouse. As for Kissy, she attempted to follow Poppy and looked around for her around the Sweet Street area, only for Lily to find and capture her as well, trapping both of them inside of her prison to treasure them as her new friends. Back over to the player, after exiting the elevator, we saw that down in the darkest depths of Playtime Co, there were the Outimals, these these creepy inside-out toys that lurked and lived around here. We ended up finding a toy Globey that allowed us to search for hidden ink drawn around the labs, along with being able to shine lights to scare the animals away. Anyway, after being jumped by one of the animals and slowly dragged away, we are saved by none other than Giblet, one of the prototype's old collaborators who had been living down here the entire time and had even made a little weapon of his to fight off the monsters. Anyway, after hiding from the prototype, who was still lurking around here, he ends up taking us over to his base, and he directed us to a new grab pack, which was in the mouth of the feeder bigger body Brawn. After exploring a little bit further, we end up running into none other than Chum Chompkins, who also worked with Giblet and tasked us with finding some research notes that they said could contain the prototype's weakness. Upon digging around a little bit and eventually finding these notes, we learned that the notes in question were actually a presentation centered around the negation compound, the stuff used to destroy biological matter and the prototype's only weakness. At the end of the presentation, they listed an archive sheet for where to find more information about the compound, listing the master backup inside of the data center as the only place containing the information. After giving these notes to Giblet and Chum, they tasked us with making our way to this data center and accessing this master backup to hopefully learn how to create this negation compound and use it against the prototype. Anyway, again, the prototype came looking for us. However, this time we actually just chose to hop into Chum Chompkins' belly like what the children used to do until the prototype passed, and sadly Chum had to leave us. Anyway, in order to get to this backup Giblet wanted us to reach, we had to cross through Sweet Street with none other than Lily Lovebrains. After having another run-in with Huggy outside of the Sweet Street's entrance, having to use projections of Kissy Missy to distract him, we finally powered on the entrance, and upon exploring, it didn't take too long for Lily Lovebrains to find us and take us into her dollhouse like the others. Upon doing so, she revealed that she wanted us to gather her friends for the tea party that was supposedly happening soon, since with her trapping the Poppy doll down in the basement, the prototype finally agreed to come over as a special guest to collect the doll. After we organized all of her toys and eventually snuck into her room, which contained the original skeleton of Miss Gracie, we find her prison key and make our way to the basement where Kissy and Poppy were locked, freeing them. On the way out, however, Lily eventually captures us and forces us to be a part of the tea party, where finally, after all this time, the prototype fully revealed himself to us, barging into Lily's house. She was excited for his presence after being ignored for so many years, although admittedly he didn't really care and was really after his prized possession, Poppy, who he finally had right in front of him once again. He explained his mission as he grabbed the Poppy doll. However, before he could do anything, he accidentally would crack her face, shocking him and causing him to drop her. Seeing this happen enraged Kissy, especially after what he did to her, so she attacked the prototype, giving us a window to escape. Lily then tried to chase us down. However, after climbing up the Sweet Street's clouds, we were able to drop one that she was standing on, leading to her falling on the floor and dying. Now, finally making it past, we met back up with Giblet, Poppy, and Kissy to tragically see Poppy's now destroyed face. But thankfully, for now, she was safe, and from here, we were directed over to the reanimation train station to find the backup. On our way there, however, Huggy Wuggy pounces once again, and after running from him for a little, we finally met back up with our pals at the train station. Huggy rushes towards us in hot pursuit. However, upon seeing Kissy, like when he was first created, he was calmed by her presence for the very first time since us entering. However, the prototype tracked us down once again and held no punches, stabbing both Huggy and Kissy, forcing us into the train right away. After riding the train for a while, Giblet directs us to jump off at the data center before it crashes with the prototype still on it. And while the crash exploded the train, the prototype somehow still survived, leaving us cornered without a way out. He quickly stabbed us as we tried to run, and finally took Poppy, for real this time. Oddly enough though, the prototype didn't leave us to die, and rather, once he had Poppy, he took our body and dropped it into the red Poppy gel, allowing our wounds to regenerate and us to survive, getting resuscitated from Giblet's staff that shocked us. However, Poppy was now gone. Nonetheless, we went to activate the backup from the data center, where we found out the archive for the negation formula was actually just the conscious backup for Harley Sawyer, who we had just reactivated into the real world. And while this is definitely not what we thought and on the surface is a bad thing, it seems like we might get to use him to finally help us capture Poppy and create the negation formula to defeat the prototype once and for all. Outside of Playtime Co though, that's not all for the story, because there was the otherwise untouched Playtime Co park that seemed unaffected by the Hour of Joy and was still occupied by the executive Eddie Ritterman, while across the sea there was the entire Japanese Playtime Co factory, which, while we saw in a note that none of the poppy flower farming material made it over, could still be running and functioning to this very day. But guys, that is all for the timeline. Let me know what you guys think of it. I obviously had to assume quite a lot of things narratively, since there's plenty of stuff that isn't fully explained or isn't given an exact date. And there's also a lot of theories that could change up the timeline a bit. Like, for instance, I went with the Rich is the player theory for this timeline, but there's infinite other plausible ideas. So let me know what you guys think of the timeline below, and I appreciate you guys watching.